Trustee Barrow. Here. Trustee Dodd.
Here.
Trustee Kurzman.
Here.
Trustee Kennedy.
Here.
Trustee Plunkett.
Here.
And President Belinsky.
Here. Okay, we have a quorum. This meeting is being conducted remotely via the Microsoft Teams software. For those of you watching this video in the future, the state of Illinois is currently under a stay-at-home order, which was issued by Governor Pritzker due to the coronavirus global pandemic. As a result, all in-person village governmental meetings
Unknown
have been canceled.
participant is now exiting.
We all good still? I just heard somebody say. Yeah, if I could recommend that people put their microphones on mute. If you're not on mute and you accidentally make some noise, you'll be on the screen, like it or not. So, however, the state has, I'll continue. However, the state has suspended the Open Meeting Act to permit electronic meetings of governmental bodies like the village board, and we are conducting our business tonight in compliance with the guidelines from the state. As usual, this meeting is being broadcast live on our local access cable channel 6. It's also on the internet tonight on YouTube, and I will read the URL for those of you who may want to switch over to YouTube because there are some interactive features there. The URL is www.youtube.com/user/Village of Wilmette/live. No spaces or anything in Village of Wilmette. Again, www.youtube.com/user/Village of Wilmette/live. A recording of this meeting will be archived on the Village's YouTube website, as we do with all of our other televised public meetings. And with this being a remote meeting, obviously it requires a different mechanic for public participation. So to ensure our residents, business owners, and other interested parties have the opportunity to participate in this meeting, we have solicited public comment prior to the start of the meeting via email. So if you sent an email to publiccomment@wilmette.com prior to the start of the meeting, our staff will read the email during the public comment portion of our agenda. Now, if members of the public who are watching the broadcast live on YouTube would like to participate during our designated public comment periods, you may submit comments through YouTube Live, and a member of the village staff will read your comment to the village board. All comments from the public will be recorded into the meeting minutes as we typically do. Now, before each meeting, the board receives a packet of agenda materials, and these materials are also posted on Wilmette.com on the Friday before our meeting, so that residents and other interested parties can review the very same materials that the board members receive. Got a little bit of an echo there. Somebody, maybe muting would be good. This week's packet contains 346 pages. The next item on the agenda is item 2, public comment. And at an in-person meeting during the public comment section of the meeting, individuals are allotted up to 3 minutes to address the board on an item which is not on the agenda. However, as I said a moment ago, this meeting is being conducted remotely, so I will ask the staff whether there were any public comments were submitted in advance of the meeting.
This is Alex Artiega from the Village Manager's Office. There were 2 public comments that were submitted.
All right, Alex, go ahead, read away.
Okay, the first comment is from Jeff Axelrod. Thank you for amending the open-ended use of Optima's $1.6 million contribution for affordable housing. I would like to see the language clarified further. It is my understanding that this contribution was intended to be used for the purchase and development of affordable housing units, not for general housing assistance. I would like to see the language amended to restrict spending to this use. Also, the Wilmette Justice Team is still waiting for our village president to appoint members to the Housing Commission so they can meet to perform this vital function supporting affordable housing in our village. There have been plenty of qualified applicants who told us they never heard back from him after their applications were submitted. Please do your job, President Belinsky. Sincerely, Jeff Axelrod, Wilmette Justice Team. That is the end of the first public comment. The second public comment comes from Ben Schmidt at 1204 Gregory Avenue. To the Village Board of Managers, I am writing to express my concern over the April 17th emergency declaration in Wilmette, extending the prior declaration and adding new restrictions on residents, visitors, and businesses. I understand that the subsequent April 24th Illinois order mirrored ours. However, my main concern remains the way our village restrictions were enacted, that they did not include enough public debate or consideration. I believe the village should consider the following points in the future. Number 1, We should be careful in taking other suburbs' actions into account to justify the actions of Wilmette. It is imperative to remember that Glenview or Skokie leadership and their constituents do not speak for ours. Number two, we should be more specific than pointing to CDC guidelines. CDC recommendations, like mask usage, are guidelines only and not law. Furthermore, another CDC coronavirus webpage titled Community Mitigation states that communities emphasize individual responsibility and empower businesses, residents, schools, and community groups to take their own precautions to implement recommendations. Wilmette is home to smart people that are fully capable of making responsible decisions on their own. Local businesses can make their own adjustments in real time. Number three, the CDC page also recommends communities tailor strategies to target population, which would demonstrate the need to evaluate village statistics and nearby hospital usage. I do not know what local information the village has evaluated thus far, and that information ideally would be made publicly available. Finally, I remain concerned over the future additional restrictions without warning or with minimal public debate. We have seen extreme measures elsewhere, including curfews, face masks anywhere in public, resident hotlines, reporting neighbor activity, and the closure of public parking lots and beaches. Those measures tend to create divisiveness, fear, and unintended consequences amongst the respective communities. I encourage otherwise in Wilmette. There are other residents that I am aware of in our village that are concerned with restrictions overall and have not spoken up because of timing and public perception. Thank you for considering my comments and for your continued work on this issue. That is the end of the two public comments that were submitted. And let me check YouTube real quick to see if there are any public comments there. There are no public comments on YouTube at this time.
Okay, well, we'll hang on for one moment. If you are watching on YouTube, you have a moment now to submit public comment if you'd like the village staff, I guess I should say Alex, to read it, since he's the designated reader. We'll pause for just a moment here, given that there actually was some public comment at this meeting, so there has been some time allowed already. But if you are interested in submitting via YouTube Live, please do that now. And we'll just pause for a moment here.
Okay.
Any comments via YouTube Live?
There are no comments.
Okay, so move on to our next item, which is the consent agenda, item 3. As is described on the agenda itself, items which are routine business that are not normally debated by the village board are placed on the consent agenda. All items beginning with the number 3 are on the consent agenda, and tonight that means items 3.1 through 3.14 are on the consent agenda. I will note that item 3.3 was amended this morning at around 10 a.m. With some late comments that came in from Trustee Kennedy. So board members received an email, and those comments were posted on the internet. So there were a handful of comments, and you should consider that to be item 3.3 from now on. So items on the consent agenda are up for approval tonight. If an item is not removed by a member of the audience and it's not removed by one of the trustees, the item will be approved and will not be discussed. So I will begin by asking if there were any such requests that were submitted in advance of the meeting by a member of the public. Mike or Alex? Did we receive any?
I'm sorry, I was muted. We did not receive any requests to remove items from the consent agenda.
Okay, so people who are watching on YouTube Live, if you would like to submit a request, you may do that now. And again, we will pause a moment to see if we do get any requests in from YouTube Live. Were there any comments, any requests via YouTube Live?
There are not, no.
Okay. So are there any items that any of the trustees would like to remove from the consent agenda?
Yes, I'd like to remove item 3.3, which I believe is the ordinance, unless I'm reading this wrong, ordinance
2020-0-22.
2022. Thank you very much.
Okay. So item 3.3 has been removed from the consent agenda. Are there any other items that any of the trustees would like to remove? Okay. May I have a motion to adopt the consent agenda?
So moved.
I think that was Trustee Sullivan that got in there first. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, that was Trustee Kennedy. It's been moved and seconded. I'd ask the clerk to please call the roll on the motion to adopt the consent agenda.
Trustee Sullivan.
Aye.
Trustee Barrow.
Aye.
Trustee Dodd.
I think you're muted.
Aye. Sorry, you guys. Aye.
Trustee Kurzman.
Aye.
Trustee Kennedy.
Aye.
Trustee Plunkett.
Aye.
President Belinsky.
Aye, so the motion carries. The consent agenda has been adopted. Next item on the agenda is item 4, report of officers. And actually, I have a report tonight. So I just wanted to highlight that the consent agenda included the reappointment of David Farina to the Police Pension Fund Board of Trustees. I'd like to recognize David tonight for his 12 years of service on the Pension Fund Board. Former Village President Chris Canning told me that David was absolutely invaluable during and after the global financial crisis when the pension fund suffered significant losses. He was an advocate and supporter of a daily domestic large cap equity purchase program which lasted over the course of months and which set the pension funds up for a very strong recovery when the economy rebounded. With the recent coronavirus-induced equity market decline, David again has advocated a course of action to mitigate the damage done to the portfolios in March, and I'm told that we are already seeing some positive results from that. So, as we all know in Wilmette, we're fortunate to have residents like David who are willing to volunteer their time and share their expertise for the benefit of the entire community. So I thank David for his service. Next, we will move on to a report from our village manager, Mr. Brayman.
I do have a brief report. First, I just want to acknowledge and thank all our village employees who continue to provide important and critical services to our community. I wanted to call special attention to employees across all of our departments who are continuing to report to work, putting their health and the health of their families at risk. I don't think we've skipped a beat in the provision of our services, and it's really a credit to the great team we have in place. I also want to acknowledge our communications team who's doing a great job getting the word out on what is going on across the community, and especially in promoting and supporting our local businesses. And we certainly encourage our residents to participate in some of our unique and fun activities, such as our takeout challenge and social distancing bingo. And if you are participating, please tag us on social media, and we'll make sure to help get the word out as well. And that is all. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Brayman. Next up is our Corporation Counsel, Mr. Stein.
I have no report, Mr. Mayor.
Next item on the agenda is item 5, report of the Liquor Control Commissioner. And there is no report tonight, so we'll move on to item 6. First is item 6.1, the Land Use Standing Committee report. Trustee Barrow.
All items are on the consent agenda.
Except for item 3.3.
Oh, yes, except for item 3. Thank you. Yes, right you are. Right you are. We have item 3.3, which is the introduction of ordinance number 2020-022, granting special use for a planned unit development, preliminary plan, pursuant to the Wilmette zoning ordinance 1210 Central Avenue, waiver of rules, adoption of ordinance 2020-022, granting special use for a planned unit development, preliminary plan, pursuant to the Wilmette zoning ordinance 1210 Central Avenue.
And is that a motion?
Yes.
Okay, so it's been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, so that's a motion from Trustee Barrow and a second from Trustee Dodd. Trustee Kennedy, you asked that this item be removed from the consent agenda, so I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, President Belinsky. I have been concerned about this ordinance, and I thank the staff for listening to my concerns and addressing the most serious ones, I believe, with an amendment that has improved the ordinance and brought it closer to what I believe was the consensus of the board at the meeting where we approved the Optima project. I still have some minor issues, but I think that I'll save those for another day. There are a couple of concerns though that I have, and they are mostly sort of procedural. The first has to do with it's sort of the intersection of our own rules regarding open meetings, the governor's emergency order that waives portions of the Open Meetings Act, and our own President Belinsky's own emergency order that establishes the rules for meetings going forward during this emergency. And I want to make sure that I'm not trying to hold this up, but what I want to do is make sure that as we take action tonight, if we do, on this ordinance, that we have the power to do that when you look at the intersection of those three things. And I'll tell you personally why I'm concerned about that is because I went back through the handbook for new trustees and was reminded that if we do anything in violation of the Open Meetings Act, it's a felony or misdemeanor, I forget, but it's a criminal, and I don't want to be a criminal. So I would appreciate, if possible, that Mr. Stein could address the board and talk about what the parameters are for what we can consider during this period in a virtual meeting format that does not involve the easy participation of the public and that does not involve the physical presence of people as required in Ordinance 2.105. Because I understand that there are urgent and emergency matters that are appropriate for meetings like this, but I'm just not sure how all these pieces fit together, and I'm not exactly sure how we define emergency and urgent, and whether this particular matter falls into that category. And again, I am not raising this issue because I'm trying to roll back what happened in March or slow it down, but I really think we need to get the procedural issues right, and we haven't yet had that conversation. So, Mr. Stein, if you could address that, I would greatly appreciate it.
Sure, Mr. Mayor, may I proceed? Okay, you're muted. I'm assuming.
Yes, go ahead.
So looking at we have to look at the governor's order, and then we look at our own executive order, and then there's two other things, or one other thing that we look at, as well as the Attorney General's guidance on this. So the executive order from the governor says that these meetings do not need a physical presence anymore, and therefore that provision is suspended. It is an unqualified suspension. Okay, we can have a meeting in a physical presence at any way, shape, or form on any matter we want based upon that order. However, that order then extends and says that public bodies are encouraged to postpone consideration of public business when possible. It says that when a meeting is necessary, public bodies are encouraged to provide video, audio, and telephonic access like we are here today. The executive order that was issued by the village president takes into account those encouragements and calls it exactly that. It says when a meeting is necessary and required, that the encouragements of the governor's order will be met to the extent possible. And we are doing that by having this in having the public comment email address, having the public comment be able to put onto YouTube, and having it being able to televise through video on YouTube. Then the Attorney General also then gives their own guidance, and they are the administrative officer that oversees the Open Meetings Act. Their guidance just says when a public body does not have critical issues that must be addressed because of time is the essence, canceling or postponing those meetings may be prudent that could otherwise pose a risk of danger to the public. So we have staff and the village board, the village president's declaration takes into account all those encouragements. And it says when things are necessary and things are required. The term emergency is not put into what is required for us to have a meeting. We use the term critical now because that is what the Attorney General has asked essentially in their encouragement. Then we look at the one last thing that this is most recent was, I think, maybe 3-4 days ago. The city of Joliet was sued for having a meeting on matters that was not necessary, that someone claimed matters were not necessary. The court did not impose that temporary restraining order, denied it outright and said there is no, in their ruling, said there is no violation of the Open Meetings Act. It said, generally speaking, it would be judicial activism for this court to tell Joliet what is and is not important to Joliet. That is, again, generally speaking, for Joliet's elected officials to decide. So if this board feels that something is not urgent or necessary, is not necessary or required, you simply do a motion to table the matter. And that's your determination as a village board. That is what the court has said. That's the separation of powers doctrine, and that is essentially we're within the confines of the law with the governor's order and still having the public participation aspect and meeting those encouragements. So the determination of something being necessary and required lies solely within this village board, and it would not be on an agenda if staff did not believe it was necessary and required, but ultimately the decision is the board to say, we want to wait and we can table this. And this is true of any matter whether we're in a pandemic or not. The board has the option to say it's not the proper time to hear something or determine something. And there's always a motion to table. So we are within the confines of the law. We have met the letter of the law, and we are even meeting the intent or the encouragements provided in that law.
Yeah, and let me just add from a public policy and transparency point of view, this matter, this is really an administrative matter here to keep this project moving along on a path. It will come back to us again after the final plans have been submitted and the village zoning administrator, I believe that's the right term, Mr. Stein, that Mr. Adler is the village zoning administrator will certify to the board that the preliminary plan has been followed, and so we will have the final plan in front of us again for our vote. From a public sort of engagement point of view, this matter was in front of the Plan Commission twice and in front of the village board twice. So I feel comfortable, the law notwithstanding, which I'm comfortable given Mr. Stein's perspective that the law is being followed, but also from sort of a good public policy point of view, that indeed this matter was basically decided at a prior meeting, which included a full meeting. I believe might have actually been our last full in-person meeting, right. And as such, that I have no issue personally responding to something to say I'm concerned that you pass this ordinance in a virtual meeting because the public policy was really decided over the course of 4 public meetings earlier this year, in which the public participated. And again, this is merely a sort of administrative step in the process, which is not complete yet.
I understand what you're saying, President Blinsky, and I don't disagree with what you've said about the prior proceedings whatsoever. I'm not questioning them or the decision that the board made. Whether or not I agree with it, it was legitimate, and I think that it was well done. But I guess the question is, what we're talking about now is not that decision, but the ordinance. And the ordinance is supposed to be a memorialization of what we decided at those meetings, in particular at the last board meeting. And that is the issue that I have, whether that ordinance reflects the agreement of the trustees, generally speaking, accurately. And many of the changes that I suggested were my judgment, which people are free to agree or disagree with, that in many respects it did not, and in other respects it was too vague. And in at least two aspects, it added things to the ordinance as being part of our decision-making that were never even discussed. One being the possible diversion of the affordable housing contribution for other purposes, and the other being a rent-free use of a parking lot or a lot across the street from the development for staging for the construction. We never discussed that, and so I'm fine with it, but I just don't like to see an ordinance that is meant to memorialize our agreement include things we never discussed. And that's what started my concern about this. I'm extremely sorry that you think my comments came late. I didn't mean that to happen. I was waiting for the exhibits to be added to that agreement before I made comments, and that didn't occur until Friday. So we have large packets, we have important things. I happen to think that the budget issues that we're going to discuss tonight are far more important, so I spent my time on those issues first. And I apologize that you consider my comments on Monday to be too late, but I still think that they need to be taken seriously. So I'm not trying to hold this up. I'm not trying to reverse the decision that was made in March. But I do think that when we have an ordinance presented to us, which is meant to memorialize what this board decided, that it should accurately reflect, as best we can say what we agreed on, what was agreed upon, and should not include things that were never discussed at all.
Well, let me interject there, in particular on sort of details like the parking. Clearly, we rely on staff for those kind of details, and it's actually a public benefit to have the construction traffic off our public streets and not in the alley and the like. So I certainly wouldn't fault the staff for that. I mean, with regards to what you characterize as the diversion of the affordable housing funds, you know, look, Mr. Stein is our attorney, the village's attorney, and I think it's relatively common in contractual negotiations that the attorney represent us as best as he can in what is a transaction with a third party. And so from the point of view of the third party, Mr. Stein's comments were added flexibility for the village at the expense of the third party. Now, I don't disagree with your comments, and I'm fine with your comments, and I think they're good clarification from a public policy point of view. But certainly Mr. Stein was representing his client in that respect, offering more flexibility when negotiating with an outside third party. Again, I have no problem with the comments. But what I guess I would ask Trustee Kennedy at this point is would you like to table this? Would you like to make a motion to table it? What would be like the course of action that you would recommend at this point in time, or that you'd like to address the board on?
The reason that I took it off the consent agenda and wanted it to stay off the consent agenda after these changes were made were twofold. One is to clarify whether we really are making a good decision to expedite this under the current circumstances, where public comment, while theoretically available through YouTube Live, is, let's face it, not easy. And some people don't know how to use it. I encountered at least one person in my old household who couldn't use it. So I think he's smart. So I think that we're making decisions, we're doing things that don't seem obviously to be urgent and that require compressing the normal time schedule. And the normal time schedule for this would be that this would be the week that we introduce it, and that 2 weeks from now we adopt it. So we're even compressing that amount of, that part of the schedule in a time when communication is difficult. And it's not my favorite way of doing things. And so I just think it deserves discussion. If nobody else is troubled by it, fine, but at least deserves discussion.
Yeah, and I guess the point, let me make one more comment, then I'll open up the floor. At this stage of the game, since we're at that administrative point, we've had opportunity for public comment, so it's not uncommon, very similar to when a zoning case comes to us with a positive recommendation, that you do it in this fashion, because the public policy decision and the public input has already taken place. And with regards to comments, I mean, we did receive, obviously, that one public comment and another email that I'm aware of. I don't know if there were others. Assume we would be aware of them. So there was some public comment. But, all right, I will open the floor if there are other trustees who'd like to be recognized.
Yeah, I'd like to be recognized.
Trustee Kurzman? Go
Yeah,
ahead.
thank you, Mr. President. I have appreciated this dialogue here. I'm glad we had it. I'm glad we're having it, even if it wasn't anticipated. I myself have found how to engage, the executive order, emergency, time-sensitive, urgency. We're all playing those things differently in our minds, and I do think that some level setting and some clarification is needed. And so, even just the previous comments from from Mr. Stein were helpful, and I'd like to see that developed more in writing, that we could all get our heads around it. My concerns about overstepping the bounds of emergency were more in the context of the March 31st Committee of the Whole meeting, but it's of the same mindset, where it's not so much the subject matter as much as it is about process and, how we're interpreting the leeway that we've been given to conduct, some amount of business in this new mode. And
Excuse me, can I interrupt you for just a moment? Somebody is typing very loudly, and I can barely hear what Mr. Kurzman is saying over the typing. Could that person please stop or mute? Thank you.
And could they teach me to type? Because they're much better at it than I. I mean, if that was me, you'd be hearing just little peck, 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 peck.
Thank you.
But so, but I do think that the discussion is necessary. And so we might not have anticipated it tonight, but I think it's worth doing. So I guess if I were to make a request, it would be for Mr. Stein to sort of develop on paper, flesh it out for us as he was starting to earlier, so that I'd have a better sense of what business is appropriate to conduct. The other angle that I put on it when I communicated on staff, and I communicated on to staff independent of Trustee Kennedy, independent of Optima, and that was really around, can we, if there's some amount of policy making we need to make at the village in order to conduct more business in through these new vehicles, then I'm receptive to it. But let's do that legwork. Let's put ourselves in a position where we can conduct more policy, where have more productive meetings, to the extent that we can. So I'm open to that, if that's a route we want to take. Now, that may or may not be permissible, but I would like to at least to have that evaluated. So in closing, I want to thank Trustee Kennedy for raising these points. I very much feel aligned with them in other contexts, and I think it's work that has to be done. So, and it's not about anyone not being above board, and I agree with her. It's not about trying to rankle the Optima project. I just think it's how we can be our best board moving forward in these circumstances.
I'd like to speak to this, President Belinsky.
Please go ahead.
So thank you, Trustee Kurzman and Trustee Kennedy. I also had a discussion with our corporate counsel today, and I think the request from the board to ask him to just create a written document about the policy under the emergency declaration, what is allowed, what is considered emergency, I think is a good request for us to be able to look at and understand as we evaluate other things. So I don't know if that's a motion we need to do. I have sent a note requesting that.
I can just direct him, or the board can just direct him to do such. So consider yourself directed, Mr. Stein.
That's direction.
As it relates to this particular project, I believe that we need, I'm comfortable proceeding with this. I believe if we're not, then we need to look at the other things on the agenda today, which would be the road projects and all the other things. And I don't think we're in a position to want to stop those. And this is, I think we need to trust our staff here in terms of what they're recommending to us. I agree with President Belinsky's perspective that, this is more a formality to a very public discussion. I view it as a formality to a very public discussion we've already had. I'm assuming, Trustee Kennedy, that your specific concerns you had around the ordinance have been addressed. I think the affordable housing one. So assuming your specific concerns have been addressed, I believe that we should proceed with this particular item, and then because we're going to take, we're going to take the opinion of our legal counsel and go forward. If not, then I agree with what Trustee Kurzman said, which I had, as you all know, I had questions about this when we talked about stormwater and all these decisions that we're making. And so I think we can't just look at one particular thing and make a decision not to proceed. That's my perspective.
Are there others who'd like to make a comment? I would, in the interim though, Mr. Stein, let's just clarify, the word emergency, is that or is that not in the governor's order? We need to be, it's an emergency declaration.
The word emergency is all over the order, but it's not applicable to the Open Meetings Act provision. The Open Meetings Act provision, which I have up in front of me here, is the order is that the physical presence of the governing body requirement is suspended. That's it. And then there's conditions, not conditions, I'm sorry, there's encouragements, no conditions, and the word emergency is not one of those conditions or one of those encouragements. Rather, it is still provide for a public process, still allow the public to watch the meeting. It's actually not mandated in there, but everybody, at least in my world, all the municipal lawyers have talked about this, and this is the process that we came up with. And then subsequently, the Attorney General has jumped on that process and has said, if you have non-critical things and non-essential things, then maybe you shouldn't have them. But again, it's not a mandate. Okay, and then the final thing is that court order that is pretty clear that this board determines what is important to it and what isn't. That's your job.
Okay, all right, fair enough. But I just want to make sure that the standard is not, we're only voting on emergency items, because there's a whole bunch of stuff on the agenda tonight and otherwise that might not be considered emergency items, including appointments of people to boards and stuff, you know.
That's my point, is if we feel all these things have to be an emergency, then we have to reconsider many of the things on the consent agenda as well as the subsequent items.
I agree. But I do want to make sure that we're correct in what we're doing. It's not that I'm, trying to come out one way or another on this issue. I just want to make it, be sure that we're doing it correctly. And the one other piece that we really haven't talked about is that our own code, in section 2.105, just precludes the participation of a trustee in a meeting by telephone. And we haven't changed that as far as I know, and it hasn't been waived, obviously, by the governor's order, because he can't do that, and it hasn't been addressed in the emergency order that Mr. Belinsky issued, so I'm not sure where we are on that piece of this puzzle. Can you enlighten us on that, Mr.
Yeah, so I understand that telephonic provision, that's actually related to a specific provision within the Open Meetings Act that says you have to have a majority of a quorum physically present in order to have telephonic, in order to have someone participate telephonically. We don't allow that as a general course of matter. So I believe that our emergency order, as well as the governor's order, specifically suspends those provisions, including our own provision that says it's not allowed.
Is that, it's not stated that way specifically. Do you think we don't need to specifically suspend our own ordinance?
Well, I think the village president's declaration does that. Whether it's expressly stated or implied, it allows for these meetings, and allows for these meetings telephonically, and the village president's declaration adopts the provisions of the governor's executive order saying that we can have telephonic or electronic.
Trustee Kennedy, if you'd like a belt and suspenders approach,
yeah, I really would.
So would you make a motion then to amend my emergency declaration such that it's crystal clear?
Would you mind? I really would propose that we amend the emergency declaration to suspend the operation of section 2.105 of the village code, which requires all trustees to be physically present at a meeting.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, seconded by Trustee Kurzman.
I'm just confused because isn't the emergency declaration on the consent agenda?
No, she's amending it again.
Again.
We're doing a belt and suspenders just to make sure that provision is covered.
Does it remove it from the consent agenda first in order to
We already approved it. So this is a brand new motion.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Can we slow down for a second? Hold on, I want to jump in here.
Yeah.
We're doing something now that was already approved and is not on the agenda. Jeff, is this the proper course of action? I don't believe it's necessary right now. If we need to amend the disaster declaration, we can bring that forward at the next meeting. with whatever other additions would be to it. I am confident in Jeff's analysis and recommendation that we're operating as we should be and legally, and I don't think we need to do something that's not on the agenda right now.
That's
Fair enough.
I was taking it as direction to draft another resolution for the next meeting.
Okay.
All right.
We will add that. I will add that to the emergency declaration for the next meeting, just as extra clarification.
Oh.
All right. So the motion, Trustee Kennedy, I guess from procedure, would you withdraw your motion?
Which motion? Oh, yes, absolutely. You mean the one just now? Okay, yes.
All right. So are there any other trustees who would like to be heard on this? Thank you, Mr. Brayman, for keeping us on the straight and narrow. Okay, so Trustee Kennedy, would you like to make a motion to table, or would you just, are you satisfied, and should we just vote? How would you like to proceed here?
Being someone who's still a little rough around the edges about parliamentary procedure, and I don't want to hold up the ordinance, even though I would make additional changes. I'm not going to press that. I think that the change in particular to Section 4 satisfies my major concerns and is a big improvement, but I'm not exactly sure on how to do this. So now that we have an amended version before it, can we just vote on the amended version, or do we need to vote on the original version of the ordinance and then amend it, if you know what I mean?
No, so the amended version, as the President stated before the consent agenda, is the ordinance before you right now.
Even though it's just presented to the public, like the stuff.
That's fine. You don't even need to present an ordinance.
Okay.
So,
Good. Easy.
So that is the one that is before you right now.
Okay, easy peasy. Then I would move that we approve the ordinance.
So you're comfortable? Okay. So let me just, before we get that far, are there any other comments from any other trustees? And I actually will ask via. If there's anybody out there watching us on YouTube Live who would like to make a public comment at this point in time, we will open it up again, and I will ask Alex if anybody does. But is there any other discussion from any of the other trustees? Okay. Alex, did anybody buzz in on YouTube Live? And we obviously did receive some public comment already that was read in public comment related to this item. But is there anybody else?
As of right now, no, there's no additional comments on YouTube.
Okay. So I will remind the trustees that this project originally came to us with a negative recommendation from the Plan Commission. So the approval that we had at the prior meeting and this ordinance does require 5 votes. I'd ask the clerk to please call the roll on the motion.
Hold on, what? Trustee Sullivan.
Aye.
Trustee Barrow.
Aye.
Trustee Dodd.
Aye.
Trustee Kurzman.
Aye.
Trustee Kennedy.
Aye.
Trustee Plunkett.
Aye.
President Belinsky.
Aye. The motion carries. The ordinance is adopted. So we will go back to Trustee Barrow. Now I believe everything's been covered.
Yes. Now all items are on the consent agenda. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm actually in the wrong agenda on my iPad. So hang on one second. Let me get to the right agenda. Okay. So we'll move on to the Finance Committee. Trustee Kennedy.
All items are on the consent agenda except for a discussion that I believe Ms. Malloy or Mr. Brayman are going to lead regarding the budget.
I'll throw a curveball. Mr. Hallgren is going to jump in and share his screen here with us.
So this is item 6.21, discussion of first quarter financial report and 2020 projections related to the COVID-19 pandemic.
I apologize. I can't do anything right tonight.
No, you're fine. You're fine, Trustee Kennedy. It's a struggle for all of us on the Microsoft Teams app here. So, Mr. Hallgren, I will turn it over to you. And I don't know, are you going to try and share your screen here? Oh, here we go. Screen shared. We can see it.
It's good to know that it is working. I was just about to verify that it was up and looking. So, based upon the feedback that we've received from the board during the past several meetings, there was a strong desire to have a financial model that would give us a tool to analyze and make assumptions about the impact of COVID-19 on the village's financials. So we developed a model that is a living, breathing document that we can update as we get real-time information that will allow us to make adjustments to these assumptions. We ultimately know that our assumptions are going to be off target, but this tool will allow us to be nimble and adjust to those changes in our assumptions to continue to provide the most up-to-date information to the public as well as the board. But from a high-level perspective, the village has made prudent financial decisions over the past several years that have put us in a strong financial position to adapt to the economic impacts of COVID-19. So what we did developing this is we developed a revenue as well as an expense model. The first part is the revenue model, which looked at our original monthly budget projections. We took historical values on a monthly basis and adjusted for seasonality to determine what our cash flow needs were. Then we looked at the impact of COVID-19, assigning different factors that reduced revenues ranging from 3 to 75% depending on the likelihood of a revenue being impacted. So for some revenues such as service fees, we assigned a minimal impact. For others such as permits or real estate transfer tax, we assigned a larger factor. But to give you some of the specifics that we did in our methodology, we can look at a couple of our key revenues. So sales tax. We looked at the unique mix of Wilmette's business community to build from the ground up. And we looked at them on a monthly and a quarterly basis. So for sales tax, for instance, we estimated that grocers would potentially see an increase of around 25% based upon initial spending after the emergency order went into place. We estimated that restaurants would see a decrease between 50 to 75%. Retailers that were closed due to the order would have their revenues go away completely. For specified periods of time. So we really tried to look at the specific businesses, whether it was looking at Jewel or it was looking at a restaurant in the downtown, to try to assign what we thought that impact was going to be. The next area that we looked at was looking at state distributed revenues such as income tax or PPRT. There we took guidance from the Governor's Office of Management and Budget, which provided some revenue revisions which were released earlier in April, and these showed a decrease of 8 to 14% depending on the duration of the economic slowdown. The last part that we really looked very closely at was the housing-related revenues, which included real estate transfer tax and permits. Here we look towards the Great Recession for some comparisons. The impact of these revenues isn't projected to be as significant because that recession was really so heavily tied to the housing market, but we still feel that there's going to be a downturn ranging from 17 to 27% for some of these areas. We have had a very positive first quarter for real estate transfer tax, and while this is a lagging indicator, we have had positive permit activity and real estate sales to date. The next factor we really wanted to look at was, our next consideration was the timing of revenue distributions. We've received initial indications from the state and county that there might be delays in property tax distributions, or from the state delays in income tax or sales tax. But we have had positive signs so far from the county that property taxes will be on time, and we continue to wait for more guidance from the state on how these distribution impacts will flow through to municipalities across the state. And then the last part of our revenue assumptions was really looking at two scenarios. The first scenario looked at reopening the economy starting in the third quarter, and then the second scenario looked at a reopening in the fourth quarter. Now, both of these scenarios did assume a structural impact to the village's tax base, so we don't automatically go back to 100%. We estimate a gradual recovery that will last into the latter part of 2020 and into 2021. So what does this mean? Well, to gauge this impact, we looked at the general fund. You can see from the chart that starting in period 4, we start to see a reduction in the revenues. Our original budget in the general fund was around $34 million, and through the first quarter, we tracked very close to our targets with our revenue projections. In the first scenario, we see a reduction of around $2.3 million, and in the second scenario, we see a projected reduction of around $3.1 million. So about another $800,000 between the two different scenarios. The next part of the analysis really we took a similar approach when we looked at the expense side. We looked at our operating expenses based upon a 3-year trend analysis for our operating expenses such as personnel, contracts, and commodities. And then we took a much more granular approach when we looked at our capital expenditure projections. Neighborhood storage, Central Avenue, the electric upgrades at the water facilities. We looked and built cash flows for these projects to know when our spending would be significant for these different projects. And we layered all of these together to determine our cash needs over the remainder of the year. Now with this, at the last meeting, staff provided a variety of cost-saving measures that included operating expenses, engineering dedicated, expenditures for a road program, as well as our capital equipment replacement fund. We included $300,000 of operating expenses in the model, but because we didn't have final decisions or didn't know what the total impact was going to be, we did not include the road program engineering items or the SURF items within the model. And then the last part on the expense side was the village's business assistance program. We approved over $500,000 in grants to our businesses in the community. We added in this assistance to the projections to look at what our total expenses would be. So again, looking to gauge the impact on the expenses, we compared the original budget projections to these updated figures. Our original budget was $35.5 million. During the first quarter, again, we tracked very much in line with our projections. And then based upon the changes in the model, the updated projection is $35.3 million, reduction of $200,000 in expenses in the general fund. So pulling these two items together, we really wanted to look at what that impact was going to be on the reserves for the general fund. We wanted to look at, this doesn't include our capital expense reduction options. We have conducted a similar analysis for water and sewer funds. They weren't included in the presentation. We wanted to focus on the general fund side. But we started the year with a $15 million reserve. In both scenarios, we layer in the revenue side as well as our expenses. If we had continued to align under normal circumstances in 2020, we would have expected to end 2020 with around $13.8 million in reserves, which would have been equivalent to around 39% of the general fund operating expenditures. Now, in the worst case scenario, as of right now, scenario 2, we expect to end the year with around $10.7 million in reserves, 30% of our operating expenses, which is still a very good number. When we look at the rating agencies, they want to see a number around 30% for reserve levels. So although we have a significant impact on our revenues, we are still in a very well-positioned place from a reserve level to maintain a AAA bond rating, as well as having cash available to provide services to the community. Also looking at the cash position side, aside from just the reserve level, we wanted to look at our liquidity position today. The village has approximately $26 million in cash. Over the next 3 months, we average around $3.3 million in revenues across our 3 major operating funds. Over that same time frame, we spend around $3.6 million on just general operating expenses. Once we start to layer in some of our larger capital expenses, such as neighborhood storage, Central Avenue, the items we mentioned earlier, we will have around $23 million of major capital expenses over the next 4 months. So there is the potential that there's some cash discussion that we have, but we are moving very aggressively towards a bond issuance in July. On tonight's meeting, there was a discussion about a financial advisor for the village, and they've already reached out to us about starting our official statement documents. So we are on top of making sure that we get to a bond issuance. But from an overall perspective, we have a significant amount of cash available to continue to pay our bills for a significant period of time, and we don't feel that we're in a very difficult position on the cash side or the reserve side. So moving forward, we have our next steps are really to continue to gather more information to update our projections and make them more precise. We will continue to update these as we have actuals for our expenses and revenues. We'll continue to evaluate our level of risk for revenues. We'll monitor the state and county for shifts in disbursements. We'll also watch the state and federal government for reimbursement opportunities associated with the emergency declaration. And we will continue to report our findings to the board and to the community as we get additional information, and continue to update the board on our expenses, revenues, and our cash position, as well as our projected reserves. So with that, that is what I have for the presentation. Open to any questions that you may have.
I'll comment, and then I will open it up for questions or comments from trustees. There's a big echo, right? So Eric may need to be you that mutes. Okay. So first off, I thank the staff. This analysis is very detailed. It's very thorough. For those of you familiar with financial lingo, it's down to the general ledger account level. And I've gone through this with the staff, and it's a great financial tool that we can use to model and monitor the impact of the coronavirus and the stay-at-home order. I'm looking forward to the staff coming back and reporting to us for where we are relative to expectations, because we need to have expectations before we can report back, whether they're better or worse than what we expected. And this really sort of, sets two goalposts. We know it's a projection. It will be wrong. All projections are wrong. It's just a question of by how much and in which direction. So it's really great that the staff is going to be using this model and comparing actual results. And, we have a number of decisions that we're going to have to make over time. We'll take those decisions as they come. We should always have an eye to the future, but we can't answer all the questions relating to later this year or next year today. But this tool and the actual results will help inform those decisions. One other comment, Trustee Kennedy and I, along with the staff, interviewed financial advisors last week, and one of the financial advisors said that the main question the rating agencies are asking is, how is COVID-19 going to affect you? What do you think? And so this is work that is really going to be valuable, and I think the staff will show very well with the rating agencies in terms of, already getting our arms around this and trying to make an estimate of how it'll impact us. So I thank Ms. Malloy, Mr. Hallgren, Mr. Brayman for all their work on this. I think it's very helpful. I will open the floor for, there's a motion on the table. There's no action to take, but if there's other trustees that would like to make a comment, I would open the floor for them. Trustee Barrett, you're on mute.
How about that?
That's better.
Good. I found this presentation and the information to be very helpful, and I really view this as if we are cutting a large piece of wood, and this is sort of the original, very first cut, and the shape of the board is still very rough, but we have a sense of what the final product might look like. So I really appreciate the work that's gone into this, particularly in a very short time. I think it's really terrific work on the staff's part. I do have a question, though, and perhaps it can't be answered here. And the question for you, Eric, is what's the significance, maybe in a quantitative way, of the percentage dropping below 30%? We know the rating agencies don't like that. But what does that actually mean for us on the edge of issuing bonds?
Might actually be better for Ms. Malloy to answer that one. Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks for asking. And as President Walensky was just alluding to, during the conversations that we had with some of the financial advisors, one in particular went through yet again what is part of the matrix that goes into deciding how they view a AAA entity. So they're assigned different percentages. I can tell you because our fund balance has gotten to the level that it is, that was actually always an item that was under credit watch for several years, and we were still at a AAA at that particular time because some of our other strengths were such that they outweighed. I think right now, we know from the last rating watch that we had in February, March of this year, we were reaffirmed as a AAA. The item that they are watching is our pension funds, and we know that we have taken steps to improve what is going to be unfunded liability going forward. I think that, coupled with the fact that we will be able to show that we are monitoring what our position is going to be relative to the impacts of COVID and the stay-at-home, I think that is going to mitigate any sort of impact that we might have, that we would drop below 30%. And remember, we're going to be going to the market by this summer. We do not anticipate that we are going to drop below that 30% prior to this happening. And again, we're going to be able to show them that we are monitoring our position going forward. So I think we're in good shape.
Yeah, and Ms. Malloy, it's also, that 30% threshold is sort of in normal times. During recessions and other sort of shocks to the system, it wouldn't be unusual for someone who's maintaining sort of that AAA 30% to drop to whatever, 25, 20%, of course, with the notion that they're going to build it back up in good times, right?
Correct. And if you remember from one of the slides that we just looked at tonight, we're actually right now closer to that 40%. What we're saying is, given the modeling that we're doing right now, our worst case model is getting us to just above 30%.
And if I can just add something here, I think it's just helpful historically to know how much higher our reserves are now than we were 5 years ago, 7 years ago. I remember when I was on the board, we were well below a 30% reserve with still a AAA rating. So I think that, residents would be comforted to know, how well a financial position we are in starting this crisis.
An excellent point, Trustee Plunkett.
Yeah.
Other questions? I know Trustee Kennedy and Trustee Sullivan both also sat down with the staff and sort of went through the details here. And I certainly encourage any other trustees, if you're interested in really rolling up the sleeves here, and you have to forgive myself and Trustee Sullivan. We're sort of finance nerds. So we were sort of into the model, but if others are interested, certainly they should reach out, and Mr. Hoggard and Ms. Malloy can walk you through it.
President Walensky, I was going to piggyback on your complimentary statements until you called me a nerd, but I guess that's the advantage of being president. But no, in all seriousness, and look, I know I pushed staff outside of the meetings as well as about a month ago. Which was pretty vocal about some of the frustrations and the concern given what we're going into, and what Mike and Eric and Melinda built and took the time. Not only did they answer my questions, they exceeded the expectations, and I think it's a compliment, obviously, to all the boards for the budgeting we've done. But this is now a tool where we can answer with solid answers to our residents. The position that we're in was still that eye to the future, and we can meet these obligations. So I would say, after going through it and spending a lot of time, we're in a good position and feel 100 times better than I did a month ago. And where we're going. We've got a lot of work to do, and we don't know what this is going to take out, but it's a good tool that's going to benefit us. And honestly, I talked to Mike earlier today, and he was answering questions that, from this tool. So I really complimented them, and good work.
Yeah, I would second that. I was very impressed in my discussions with staff about the sophistication and the accuracy of the model, and more importantly, its ability to function in a kind of liquid way where we can continue to change the assumptions as we get more data and get closer and closer to the right answer as we get to the end of the year. And I haven't seen anything like that, and it's very, very, very impressive. It must have taken far more work than we're acknowledging to get it to this place, and I'm grateful for that.
Okay. Any further comments or questions, in particular questions for the staff? This one question that any sort of impact from the Optima project in terms of permit fees or anything like that, that's not included in this model, and potentially upside in the event that those permits are issued later this year. That's an accurate statement, right?
Yes,
that is an accurate statement.
Okay. Great. I think we will move on. Trustee Kennedy, that was the only thing you had, so I will move on to the Administration Committee with Trustee Dodd.
All items were on consent.
And then I'll move to the Municipal Services Committee, which is Trustee Sullivan.
We have two items this evening. The first is item 6.41, which is approval of a contract in the amount not to exceed $2,344,369 with J.A. Johnson Paving Company, Arlington Heights, Illinois, for the 2020 MFT road program. And I believe I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Brayman.
Well, I need that was a motion, right?
Oh, right.
And so I need a second.
Second.
All right, so that was Trustee Kennedy with the second.
Now,
and then, yes, I believe we're turning it over to Mr. Brayman.
All right, thank you. And Eric's going to pull those slides back up, and he's going to share the screen and move through it as I talk, so bear with us if it's a little clunky, but we'll move on to the next slide here. Right, Eric?
I have the red box around it, but is it not sharing?
No. It's sharing. It's on the last slide of the financial presentation.
All right.
There we go.
All right.
All right, so I'm going to provide a very brief high-level overview here just to kind of set the table for discussion, and then Bridget and Dan are available to answer all the actual engineering and detailed questions. So Eric, if you can move to the next slide here. The first item that's up for approval is what Trustee Sullivan just made a motion on. It's the road program. Just to clarify for the board, this is the full road program that we intended to complete this year based upon our discussions in fall and winter of 2019, where we wanted to increase the funding and get more work done. As you can see, we're doing 4% of the village's non-brick roadways, and in the memorandum, that 2.45 miles is substantially greater than any of our programs in the last 4 or 5 years. Engineering and our finance purchasing team did a great job getting these bids out early in the season, so we have competitive pricing that's $55,000 under budget, so that's savings we can bank to help offset some of our COVID losses. And we were even able to include additional streets via alternates, so we're able to do more work than we had even set out to do when the board reviewed our road program last year. So that's all really good news. And we also have additional flexibilities. So on June 6th, we'll be coming back to the board and asking the board to consider whether or not we want to reduce this contract by 3 blocks and save about $215,000. And that'll obviously be dependent on the status of the economy and the pandemic. And it's nice to have that additional time and flexibility to make that decision when we have more data. So the contract up for approval tonight includes these 3 blocks, but we can scale those back out of the contract by June 6th. Eric, if you can go to the next slide. I'm not going to spend any time on this. This is just for reference, but it shows you the poor condition that the roads are in that are included in this bid. And we'll get into this in much more detail prior to our June 6th meeting and on June 6th, so the board can see the impacts of any deferrals as well as what that means for 21 and the condition of the roads that are projected for repair then. You can go to the next slide here. So this is the next contract. So right now we're talking about the road program. These really are all related, so I'm going to run through this slide and the next one before we vote on the roads, and then we go to the alleys. The next contract is the alley and Brick Street maintenance contract. Its bid is one contract, but it's actually 2 or 3 separate programs. Once again, the engineering and finance teams did a good job getting this out early, so we're almost $94,000 under budget, and that's savings we can bank. Alleys, we're repairing 3.5 alleys. It's a half because the other half was repaired several years ago, so this will just complete the rest of that process. And just like the road program, we have until June 6th to make a decision on whether we want to scale back some of this contract. So we can reduce the contract by 1.5 alleys or $172,000 if we feel we need to save additional dollars as we move through this pandemic. And then on the Brick Street maintenance, this is not the Brick Street restoration program where we restore an entire block. As the board may recall, we made the decision to defer that for 2020 and allocate those funds to our annual road program to increase that funding. So we're not doing a restoration. The maintenance is just spot repairs located throughout all of our brick streets in the community. It's 4,400 square feet. This is the amount that we had set in the budget. We did get really solid bids on this, so we're saving a substantial amount of money, but doing all the work we had planned to complete. And then the final slide here is what was on the cover memo in the board's packet. And I trust Eric will move to that one next. There we go. So this just gives, this is the high-level decision timeline we have. We have a lot of flexibility to get some better data and make more informed decisions as we move through this year. So the savings recommendation, the first slide, is what staff has recommended for our last several board meetings. And then we show the possible additional savings, which we've already talked about for the streets, the alleys, and the bricks. So some of those decisions need to be made in June, others in July. So we'll keep the board updated. We're going to be doing, as Eric mentioned, monthly financial updates to the board, the second meeting every month as we're closing out the previous month, and we'll be more informed to make these decisions. So it's really nice to have the flexibility of time to get that data and then make the right decision as we move forward.
Okay, so I will open the floor if there are any questions. In a normal environment, this would normally be on the consent agenda as we've sort of approved all this stuff and went through it as part of the budget process. But obviously we're not in normal times as we're all looking at each other on our computer screens. So open it up if there are any questions for the staff at this point in time on this.
Hey, President Belinsky, should I, since we covered both, should I make the second motion on item 6.42 before we get into discussion?
We'll do the discussion, we'll vote on 641, then we can quickly go through 642. Okay. Any questions?
Not for me.
No, I think we had a pretty high-level discussion about this 2 weeks ago, and we felt very confident, in our financial position that we got good bids and we wanted to go ahead with this. And I think it's, really prudent that we can look again in June for the alternates. But, I think this work has to be done, and I think, people will appreciate seeing work being done in the community and construction going on right now. And I'm looking forward to hearing some construction noise out there.
It feels a little more normal when there's construction going on, doesn't it?
Indeed.
And as Trustee Plunkett pointed out here, and I should have pointed out, we did talk about this a little bit more in depth at a prior meeting. So if there's no other comments, I will ask the clerk to call the roll on item 6.41, which is approval of the contract in an amount not to exceed $2.3 million with J.A. Johnson Paving Company.
Trustee Sullivan?
Aye.
Trustee Barrow?
Aye.
Trustee Dodd?
Aye.
Trustee Kurzman?
Aye.
Trustee Kennedy?
Aye.
Trustee Plunkett?
Aye.
President Belinsky?
Aye. So the motion carries. The contract has been approved. So Trustee Sullivan, I'll ask for a motion on the next one then.
So it's make a motion for approval of a contract in the amount not to exceed $845,072 with Schrader and Schrader Inc., Skokie, Illinois, for the 2020 Alley and Brick Street Grade Construction Program.
Is there a second?
Second.
I'm not sure who got that in first. Maybe Trustee Plunkett. Was there a second from you, Trustee Plunkett?
Yeah, there's one of them.
Okay. All right, so we'll give the second to Trustee Plunkett. Any questions here? Okay, so would the clerk please call the roll on item 6.42?
Trustee Sullivan?
Aye.
Trustee Barrow?
Aye.
Trustee Dodd?
Aye.
Trustee Kurzman?
Aye.
Trustee Kennedy?
Aye.
Trustee Plunkett?
Aye.
President Belinsky?
Aye, so motion carries. The contract has also been approved. And that's it for Trustee Sullivan. So we'll move on to public safety with Trustee Kurzman.
No report.
And judiciary with Trustee Plunkett.
No report.
Item 6.7 is reports from special committees. There are no reports. Item 7 is new business. There's no additional new business to discuss. So we'll move on to item 8, which is adjournment. May I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
I think that was Trustee Barrow that time. He was first in. And again, since we are remote, I would ask the clerk to call the roll on the motion.
Trustee Sullivan?
Aye.
Trustee Barrow?
Aye.
Trustee Dodd?
Aye.
Trustee Kurzman?
Aye.
Trustee Kennedy?
Aye.
Trustee Plunkett?
Aye.
President Belinsky?
Aye, so the motion carries. We stand adjourned at 8:17 p.m. Thank you again, all of you, for your patience and understanding as we, make do and the best we can right now in difficult times. But hopefully, if you look at the numbers are improving out there. So hopefully we'll be getting through this soon. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Good night.
Aye.
Total info. Weather.